What's going on, world? Welcome to my podcast. It's Just Different with Ty, where I talk about sports, social, political issues, you name it, everything under the sun. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Also, hit the notification bell so you can get updated on all the latest, newest videos. And please leave comments section below.
Welcome to It's Just Different with your host, Ty.
Part two. All right, part two. I'm here with the author of Disunited Brotherhoods, Race Racketeering in the Fall of the New York Construction Unions. I'm here with Mr. Gregory A. Butler. Mr. Butler, how you doing, sir?
All right. How are you?
I am blessed. I'm fine. I'm excited. And, a few people asked me, they seen part one and they had a lot of questions.
Okay.
And, so hopefully, we can get to them. You'll be able to answer them. And, let's get right into it. So I'm going to pick up on where we left off at. And I'm going to talk about a certain section in your book. And just to put out there, some of these parts is some of the questions I have asked are not only from me, but from what other people ask or what they have to say. And I try to highlight the things that I feel that are important that may stand out. So, now I want to ask you about, and I'm going to read this part right here. You talk about, it says here, at the time, there was a federal civil case, United States versus the New York City District Council of Carpenters. They charged the leaders of the district council and the 17 locals then affiliated with it with being under the control of the organized crime, specifically the Genovese, Gambino, Colombo, and if I'm saying it right, the Cavalcante families of Costa Nostra. Yeah. Can you talk about that, sir?
First of all, you said the Cavalcante perfectly. Back in 1916, there was, at the time, construction unions were very early on in their existence. There had been a big strike. It had really disrupted production and forced the employers to give a big raise they didn't want to give. Also, there was a lot of chaos and competition in the construction industry because there were lots of small contractors undercutting each other. And basically, the bigger and stronger contractors wanted to have some way to regulate competition in the industry and kind of set up a cartel where they would control who would get the work, who would get the jobs. So they would be able to set the prices that they charge to the developers and the property owners. And they needed, since that's actually illegal, you cannot legally do that. That's called a trust, and that's a violation of federal and state antitrust laws. You have to do that illegally. So they approached gangsters and would have them come in and organize these cartels. And the gangsters would regulate competition in the industry. They would keep out, marginal companies from trying to get in the market by underbidding. Because in construction, I should explain, when you're putting up a building and it's a large scale building, you go out and you put out a request for proposals, contractors bid on it, you take the lowest bidder. Problem is, the lower your bid is, if you go too low, your profits are very low. You can actually lose money if you take a job that's too low, because you still have to pay for materials, you still have to pay for labor, you have to pay your workers, and you want to, if you're a business person in the construction industry, if you're a contractor, you want to make money. And if you're a general contractor, you're also managing a bunch of subcontractors that actually do the work. that you have to pay them as well. Then they have to pay for their materials, they have to pay for their labor, and you have to do all of that and do the job in a timely fashion and actually make money on it. So the racketeers came in and they regulated the industry. Now, how did they do that since it's illegal to do that? Well, they are criminals. They did so using criminal means, which is one way they did was they were able to, as I discussed at length later on in the book, take control of some of the major unions and to use them as an instrument where if you were a company that was part of the cartel, you would never have a problem with the union no matter what you did to your workers. If you were a company that wasn't part of the cartel, you would have problems with the union no matter how good you treated your workers. So initially, the gangsters that were involved in this at that time, most of the gangsters in New York were Irish. There was a man named Robert Brindell, who was the man that ran this racket. He was an Irish American. He had taken over a carpenter's local that actually still exists. He took it over and used that as an instrument to help run these rackets. He eventually went to prison in 1921. He was one of the first American racketeers to go to prison because at the time the racketeering laws didn't really exist. They kind of had to create a whole new area of law because of him. And when he was displaced, there was still a need for racketeers to regulate competition in the industry and to keep a handle on the unions so they didn't actually fight for their members. They were junior partners with the employers and the gangsters. And the Italian criminal syndicates known as Cosa Nostra, that's Sicilian Italian for this thing of ours, the organization commonly known as the Mafia, they come in to replace Brindell's cartel. They pretty much ran it the same way. Basically, they would run it was they would decide which companies would get to bid on major jobs, and they would set it up so it appeared to be that there was an actual legitimate bidding process. But what actually happened was it was all rigged out in advance. They would rig out who would have the lowest bid, and they would inflate the bids. So even the lowest bid was enough to make money. Now, all this stuff is illegal. It's a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act, which are federal laws against cartels. It also violates New York State's laws against cartels. All this stuff is illegal, but it was how construction was done in New York for many years. These things still exist. Just this week, there were a bunch of contractors and a gangster who were arrested right here in New York for doing the same thing. There's still, there's still people that do this today because there's still a need for it because, look, the real estate developers and the property owners want to pay as little as possible for construction because when a building is being built or having major maintenance done to it, they're not making money from it. They want to pay as little as possible for construction and get the building built or renovated as quickly as possible. But the contractors want to make as much money as they can on the project because that's how they make money. That's the business they're in. And you can't control the cost of materials. Materials manufacturers set that. There's only so much you can do with that. And with labor, well, the big conflict between contractors and the unions is contractors want to pay as little as possible for labor. But at that time, most construction workers in New York City were unionized. So you pretty much had to pay union scale. But if you were connected with the rackets, there were times when they would let you pay people less than union scale for certain types of work. So this goes on for many, many years where basically gangsters control construction in New York City. And actually there reaches a point where they're literally charging a tax on major construction jobs, where if you had a big construction job, you would pay 2% of the cost of that project to whatever, gangster was in charge of that project. And that was your, the word for it is tribute. It was basically a tax. The developers called it the mob tax. And this goes on from, like I said, from like 1916 into the 1990s. Now, the problem is this made New York a very expensive place to build. And even over the years, as parts of construction become non-union and it's possible to pay workers very low wages. Well, also on a labor angle, because I've talked about the business side of it. On the labor side of it, what happens is the unions become very unaccountable to the members. They become accountable to the gangsters. They become subordinated to the contractors and their interests. One of the reasons that construction is such a terrible industry to work in to this day is because of that. There's a reason why construction workers don't have a steady job. Basically, you're hired by the day. If they like you, they keep calling you back, and you might have something close to a permanent job. But if they don't like you, or if you're just some guy that they need, they hire you for as long as they need you, and then the minute they're done with you, they get rid of you. Which is why even for the best paid and most connected construction workers, it's basically a temp job. One of the reasons that working conditions in construction are as bad as they are, one of the reasons the job is as dangerous as it is because the unions have never really fought to make it into a decent, steady job. Could they have done that? Yeah. But because of the racketeering influence, they didn't. And over time, eventually, because the contractors want to lower their costs, the mafia lets more and more sections of the industry go non-union. The unions do nothing to resist this. Finally, you reach a point by the 1970s where pretty much most of construction of housing and most residential construction in New York has become non-union. By the 1990s, right now we're at the point where roughly 75% of construction is non-union. In New York City is non-union.
Really?
That's something that even in the years after the mafia got driven out of construction, I'll go into that in a second, it hasn't reversed the decline of the unions. If anything, that accelerated it. Now, the problem was it reached a point in the 1990s where the developers were sick and tired of paying this mob tax. They wanted actually to have a situation where they could put out bids and have people legitimately compete for work. They wanted more of a share of the profits that come from improving or building or improving a property. So the government came in, and since all this stuff is extremely illegal, and it's illegal stuff, it's crimes committed against rich people. You're taking money from rich people, which is always something that gets taken very seriously because rich people have more power and influence than the rest of us. When bad things happen to them, their needs get taken care of. They get protected. So eventually, by the 90s, and I go into it at very, very great length in the book, Cosa Nostra had gotten driven out of the industry. A lot of the gangsters had went to prison. A lot of the gangster-connected union leaders went to prison. And it was a vacuum because now that the contractors had to actually legitimately bid on jobs and had to offer the lowest bid, they had to reduce the price of labor, which gave them an incentive to stop being union, because being union means you have steady source of labor. You can call a union and they have hiring halls where they can send people to work. And there's advantages to being union, but there's disadvantages. When you use union labor, you have to pay union wages, you have to pay union benefits. And that's expensive. And it's cheaper to pay people whatever you can get away with paying them. And you can reduce your bids by reducing how much you pay your workers. So that's how construction becomes a low-wage job in New York. That's why today most construction workers in New York make poverty-level wages and have no benefits and basically work under sweatshop conditions. And many years of racketeer domination basically led to a situation where the unions were too weak to fight back when the gangsters got driven out. So that's the long version, and that's the short version. And it certainly as a labor question, it made the unions very weak because they really they had a very dependent, servile relationship with the gangsters, and they weren't based on workers fighting, using their power to fight on the job to make the job better. So that made the unions very weak. And once Cosa Nostra was out, they didn't have the strength to stand up on their own 2 feet. So that's the short version. I literally wrote a book on it, so there's a lot more to it. But that's the 5-minute summary.
But I thank you for that. There's some questions I want to ask and things that you said that I didn't even write down. It's just because you brought it up.
Okay.
It was good because I was going to lead into my next question, but you, like I said, you actually brought it up with the whole Branco thing. He in 1921, I think he was the first. Oh, I can't remember the date. He was the first one to get charged, and arrested for this. That was my next question, but you answered it. Now, you said, correct me if I'm wrong, I'll paraphrase, that the La Cosa Nostra was weakened or driven out of these unions, right?
Yeah, they were.
Do you think, because I've listened to other union people, union members, brothers and sisters that still believe and is still under the belief that the mob still has somewhat of an influence on union jobs today in 2023. Do you think that's the case? Or that's just,
It's way less than it used to be. Are there still people from Cosa Nostra that have a presence in construction? Sure. Is it anything like it was, say, when I got in the union? Absolutely not. They're far weaker and they have far less power. So there's a few individuals who are Cosa Nostra connected, but it's not like before where you actually had this wholesale institutional control of the unions and of the employer associations and of the bidding process. It's not like it was 20 years ago at all. But are there still people that are Cosa Nostra connected that are in or around construction? Sure there are. But it's not like, say in the 1980s, if you were doing a concrete job in New York City with a value of more than $2 million, you'd have to go to a pizza shop in the Italian part of East Harlem. And there was a man named Anthony Salerno, known to his friends as Fat Tony, who was the underboss of the Genovese crime family and also himself a concrete contractor. You have to go to him and he'd decide who'd get your job. And if it was a fairly large job, you literally had to use his company, S&A Concrete. So, but that is it like that? Anything like that now? Absolutely not. Anthony Salerno was convicted on multiple counts of labor racketeering. He was sentenced to 80 years in a federal penitentiary. He died in a federal prison in the 90s. So the days where someone like you go into the back room of a pizza shop and pay a man, some random guy, a large sum of money to decide who was going to do who was going to bid on your job, that is long gone. That's long since disappeared. A lot of those companies that were on his list of companies that he gave those jobs to literally don't even exist anymore. Because that's long gone. So it's not, there's a perception because Cosa Nostra was so powerful for as long as it was that there's still this kind of influence, but there isn't. That's one thing that they did. Law enforcement did succeed in largely driving Cosa Nostra out of construction, also out of the Fulton Fish Market, also out of control of the hauling of commercial garbage in New York City. That was another industry they controlled. Also out of the trucking in the garment district. All those industries that used to be Cosa Nostra controlled, out of the waterfront, unloading the cargo ships in New York Harbor. All that stuff with Cosa Nostra used to be a presence. They're not anymore.
Okay, cool. Thanks for answering that. Yeah. So some union members and brothers are still going to be under belief, and that's their opinion. That's cool. That is still heavily, the mob is still heavily influenced, but that's cool. Right. Thank you for answering that. Now you talk about the guy, let's say Fat Tony, whatever. You also wrote something, you added in your book, the big crime boss, John Gotti.
Yeah.
You have him in your book, and I believe you said something in there, him getting into a situation with like a district union leader or something like that. Can you go into that?
Well, basically, what happened was one of the organizing techniques the unions used back in those days was they would go to a job where a non-union contractor was working or a contractor who was union but wasn't connected, and they would vandalize the job site. It was known as a wrecking crew. So there was a guy who was, I believe it, again, I'm citing some memory. I believe it was John O'Connor, I think, of the Carpenters Union, who was sent a wrecking crew to there was a bar called Bankers and Brokers. And they had used a company that, well, they were non-union. What he didn't know was they were under the protection of the Gambino crime family. Now, Carpenters Union in New York was controlled by the Genoveses, so they might not have been aware that this company had a relationship with the Gambinos, who did a lot less construction, labor racketeering. The Genoveses were by far the dominant Cosa Nostra family when it came to labor racketeering. So what happened was, John, the guy complained, oh, this guy sent a wrecking crew to my job and destroyed it. It was a bar called Bankers and Brokers. And I'm sure, like a lot of New York Irish bars, it had a lot of nice woodwork in it, and they destroyed it. And that's a very expensive job to vandalize. So basically, Gotti sent a hitman who was an associate of the Gambino family, an Irish guy who was an associate of the Gambino family, sent him to local 608's Union Hall, and they shot Mr. O'Connor 4 times in the buttocks. And didn't kill him, but gave him a warning. And that sort of thing would occasionally happen when things like that would happen. That's how the Cosa Nostra enforced its rackets. It was always understood if you didn't go along with the process, these people would have no problem hurting you or even killing you. And there were people who actually got killed because of that sort of thing. So, like, there was a president of the district council who was going to testify in a racketeering trial, who was actually, disappeared and has never been seen again,
Really?
presumably murdered in that same era. Because this is an era where Cosa Nostra's power is declining, and when criminal syndicates are in crisis, all the stuff that normally gets done relatively smoothly with the implied threat of violence has to involve actual violence. Because, criminals aren't the most ethical people. When they see a racket in decline and they see that they can just make their own moves for their own benefit without regard to the interests of the broader syndicate, they will. Which is why criminal syndicates are always kept together by the threat of violence. Like the Mexican cartels. For many years, they ran things smoothly with just the threat of violence. But once things got unstable, they had to use actual violence, which gets very chaotic very quickly. Also leads to a lot of people ending up going to the police and telling what they know, because they will put you in witness protection. So that's why witness protection exists, because there's people racketeers that did the wrong thing and they're in danger of being murdered. They go to the police and they tell what they know, and in return they get protected. And the people who are going to kill them end up going to prison. So that's what caused the rackets in New York to break up. And that sort of thing, like O'Connor being shot, is the sort of thing that happens when racketeering cartels are in crisis. And that cartel within a decade was totally gone. Like when I wrote that book in 2006, Cosa Nostra was still a little bit in construction, but not like it was in the 90s or the 80s. And by now, they're all but totally gone. There's still a few wise guys involved in construction racketeering, but not on anything like the scale it used to be.
Okay. So you say, all right, the 90s, 80s, that's when the Cosa Nostra was in its prime, or, at its height, right?
Right.
And now, that's a lot of great information. Mr. Butler, thank you. I appreciate you. Now, I want to not steer off too much. I'm going to go back to it because it's something that you talk about time and different things like that. And you probably talked about it in your first response, but I just want to make sure I highlight this. You write in your book, however, there was a catastrophic decline in union power in the New York City construction industry during the 1970s. Union membership at NYC Building and Construction Trades Council fell 60% from 250,000 to under 100,000, while the industry's total workforce only declined by 20% from 250,000 to 200,000.
Yeah.
So was that had anything to do with the mob or anything? Or that was just totally something different.
Well, it was part of it, but also another part of it was at that time, up until the 70s, pretty much all construction in New York was union. Now, it happened in the 70s, you had a situation where a lot of landlords wanted to abandon their properties because they weren't as profitable as they used to be, because New York used to have fairly strict rent control and you couldn't jack up the rent as much as you wanted. So a lot of landlords had properties they wanted to get rid of that they couldn't sell them. So they hired arsonists and they burned them. And much of New York City gets burned to the ground in this era, particularly large areas of Upper Manhattan and Central Brooklyn and Southeast Queens. And of course the South Bronx. So the city ends up in this situation where you have these vast areas of the city full of abandoned. If you lived in New York in that era, you remember all the vacant lots, all the burned out buildings, and all these vast areas of the city were full of rubble. And they had to do something about that. So the city and a lot of these properties, because the landlords had abandoned them, they fell under city ownership because the landlords, having abandoned the property, stopped paying the property taxes, and the properties became in rent. And that is to say, the city took them over. So the city has all this land with abandoned buildings on it, and they got to do something with it. So they end up getting developers and building housing on these sites, building apartment buildings. Now, the problem is they had to build them with union labor, and that's expensive, and it's the city doing the work. The city wants to pay as little as possible for budgetary reasons. They want to pay as little as possible. So legally, when you're doing city construction work, you have to pay what's called prevailing wage, which is a wage scale set by the Department of Labor based on the prevailing wage of the area. If you're in an area where there's any kind of significant union presence, generally speaking, prevailing wage is set to what the unions pay. So what the city does is they end up having, instead of the city doing the work, they have these not-for-profit organizations do the work and be in charge of these redevelopment projects. And since these not-for-profit organizations are not city entities, they're private entities, they're not bound by prevailing wage. And so what they start doing, because it's public money, but it's public money being spent by private entities. So what they end up doing is they decide, well, we're going to start using non-union contractors because, well, it's cheaper. And there was non-union work on the margins of the industry, building houses, doing build-out work in small stores, and these companies end up bidding on this work. And you also have union companies quietly setting up subsidiaries that are non-union to bid on this work. And the unions don't do anything about it. I mean, basically, they speak to their mafia. If the unions had been stronger, they could have simply called strikes and shut down these jobs and made these companies go union. That's what a healthy labor movement would have done. But we didn't have a healthy labor movement at that time. We had a racketeer-dominated, racially segregated labor movement. And what ends up happening is that they complain to Cosa Nostra, and Cosa Nostra figured out a way to make money on it. So they end up also shaking down these non-union contractors for money, and they end up protecting them from any sort of strikes or labor actions by the union. And at this point, the unions aren't really doing any sort of healthy organizing or strike activity. To the extent they do anything, it's basically they'll send a bunch of thugs in to break a place up. Because the idea of actually organizing workers to go on strike is something that they just hadn't done in 60 or 70 years because they've been for so long a junior partner of the racketeers. Also, these jobs, because they're open to anybody, because they're non-union jobs, they end up hiring a lot of Black, Latino, and Chinese workers who have been the people who've been largely kept out of the unions up to that point. The coalition had started letting people in. So there's a pool of people that do this kind of work now who are workers of color. And they end up being the dominant workforce in these non-union jobs. And they have no particular loyalty to the union because, well, why would they? The unions had never done anything to help them or fight for their interests and actually fought to keep them out of the industry. So you end up with much of this work being done non-union. And a lot of this happens under the Koch administration, where pretty much all of the housing renovation work that they're doing is all non-union. Now, the unions made a vain attempt, the Carpenters Union particularly made a vain attempt to keep some of this work union by offering a lower pay scale for that kind of work. Some other unions, the Painters Union, objected to that. They actually had a brief strike in 1978 against that. And with the help of the Mafia and the Plasterers Union, that strike was broken. But it didn't have, the unions did not have an answer to that. The unions were incapable of organizing these workers to have them go on strike to make that work union. So they lost that work. And that's how you get to the point where pretty much most of the housing renovation and construction work, particularly low-income housing, is all done non-union. And that's when you end up with this is the tipping point. This is the beginning of the end. And within a few years, 60% of the industry is non-union, like I wrote about in the book. That's how that happened. And the unions, weakened as they were by racism and racketeering, were unable to do anything about that. They needed doing it to keep the work union. And eventually it hurt all union workers because over time the unions declined. And now you're at a point where 80% of the industry is non-union. And about 75% of the workforce are non-union. Today, there's 400,000 construction workers in New York City, which is an all-time high. And the reason they can afford to hire so many people is because construction labor is very cheap. 300,000 of those workers are non-union. And probably about 100,000 of them work off the books. So they're very cheap labor. It's become, it's got to a point in the 90s, a lot of construction workers drove to work in cars, and a lot of them had late model luxury cars. I even have worked in job sites where you'd see people driving to work in Cadillacs. It's regular carpenters, not contractors, just regular workers, or BMWs. Today, if you go to a lot of non-union construction sites, you'll literally see workers coming to work on bicycles because they can't afford a Metro car. So we went from Cadillacs to bicycles in 40 years. And that was the human cost of racism and racketeering and how they weakened the construction unions, and how in a city that was once the strongest union city in the nation for construction, it's now not. It's an industry where most construction is done with non-union workers, often very low-paid non-union workers. And it's become an industry where much of the workforce are recent immigrants or parolees that just got home from prison because literally they take the job because they can't get anything else. They can't get anything better.
Mm-hmm. And this just ain't, I know the title, is New York construction, I've also read in your book that you mentioned several times Chicago and Philadelphia as well, correct?
Yeah. I mean, over there it was a little different because construction is a very local industry. So what happens in different construction markets can often be very different. The unions still have a little bit of strength in those areas. They're probably like among Philadelphia, Chicago, Seattle, Portland, the San Francisco Bay Area are probably among the few union strongholds left in the construction industry. Nationally, most of the industry looks like New York, where if it's a major building, it's probably union. Although in New York, you literally have 60-story buildings being built entirely non-union. So the unions are really decayed here. But in most of the country, some major projects get done union, by no means all. And all the smaller jobs are all non-union to a greater or lesser degree. So it's something that nationally, Cosa Nostra wasn't as a big a player in construction as it was in New York. New York's a uniquely competitive market where there's lots of competition for contractors in the industry, and other cities aren't like that. Other cities' construction markets are more stable, so there's not that kind of intense competition that causes them to be willing to break the law to stay in business.
Whew. Mr. Butler, you preaching today. You spit nothing but facts. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So I want to ask about this because this stood out to me in my mind, in my conspiracy mind. Maybe I'm reading it the wrong way, or interpreting it the wrong way. I want to read this real quick. I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to read a sentence. The Pavers and Rammerman's District Council, and Rammerman's with an R, and I want to read this section right here that you wrote. Since those PRDC members had close ties to the Democratic Party machine, that made any interference in that union a very delicate political matter for the feds, the FBI. Can you explain what is I never heard of that. The Pavers and Rammerman's District Council and all this about their connection to the Democratic Party and how it even made it hard for the feds to do what it is. Am I reading that correctly, or am I misinterpreting it?
Basically, Pavers and Rammerman are the people that do street paving. You see people paving the streets. That's people who do that work. Now, in Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, that work is entirely done by city employees. In Queens, road paving is done by private contractors, and these companies are connected. At that time, they were connected with Cosa Nostra. They also were connected with the Democratic Party because this is all this work is done by the city, by the New York City Department of Transportation. They're the people that give out road building contracts. And there's a whole lot of political patronage involved in how those companies get those contracts given out. And the companies that get those contracts, generally speaking, are politically connected. So, yeah, and New York City is a solidly Democratic town. So basically, they're connected with the Democratic machine, specifically the Democratic machine in Queens, which is where most of the private road building in New York City happens. So, yeah, that was something that they had. When going after those companies, you had to be very careful because they were connected with the Democratic machine, and that created a lot of political consequences.
Okay. All right. Now you talk about, I heard you say something about the New York District Council before, the Carpenters before. But again, I want to highlight this because it only has the feds in there. So I'm just trying to see if there's some type of whole big conglomerate thing. Again, that's just me. So I'm asking because it stands out. You're right that was the underlying reason why the feds, despite extraordinary effort, failed to subordinate the New York District Council of Carpenters to the interests of the developers and the financiers. Well,
basically, to explain that, eventually the goal was that they wanted what they really wanted to do is they wanted to reduce labor costs for the developers, but do it legally. Because ultimately their agenda was they wanted to pay as little as possible. The contractors they are willing to pay those wages if they could pass along the cost of it to the developers, but that was no longer possible. What I was alluding to there was an attempt to kind of maintain the system that had existed before, but with the unions enforcing pay cuts on behalf of the developers, and that didn't happen, which I go into in great detail in the book about why. But basically, that's what I'm alluding to there.
Okay, now, I noticed you talk about, and I read it a lot. I should have asked it first instead of getting into the racketeering stuff, but you talk about an event happening at the Jacob Javits Center. And even here, and I'm only bringing him up because he's from Peekskill, fellow Peekskill, George Pataki. You put on July 25th, 1995, the day after the NYDCFC election was completed down at the borough of Manhattan Community College, Governor Pataki sent a force of 200 New York State troopers to seize the Javits Center. What is going on here?
Okay, well, and I should point out, I actually worked at the Javits Center for several years, including around the time this book was written. Basically, what the Javits Center is a convention center. They have events where basically trade associations for various industries will have events where different companies will have booths set up. Like if you've ever been to the auto show, events similar like that, The auto show is a public show. It's open to the general public. There are other trade shows that are just for the industry. And basically, you have a bunch of booths that get set up in a space, and they have to be set up fairly quickly. And then after the event ends, they all have to be taken apart. Since these trade shows often travel around the country, what happens is a bunch of trucks with a bunch of crates come to the convention center. There's workers that unload the trucks. They take out the crates. And then there are workers that unload the crates and put the booths together, and they store the crates. Then the event happens, and then workers come back and they take the show down, and they put everything, and they put the crates back, and they put all the material back in the crates, and the crates get put in the trucks and shipped out of the back to going to the next destination. And the workers who do that, well, basically, Cosa Nostra had an influence in the trade show services industry. They had a relationship with the contractors who did that work, and they controlled who got hired for those jobs. And actually, there was a point where there was a small pool of guys who were connected, who worked on these shows all the time. And then when they needed extra people, they'd call the unions, and they would send people to these jobs. The unions in question, the people who put together and took down the booths and put down all the carpeting were members of the Carpenters Union. You had stagehands, members of the Stagehands Union, who would help the carpenters with the packing and unpacking of the crates. And there were members of the Teamsters Union that unloaded the trucks. They also drove the trucks for some of the contractors and some of the local warehouses that served the industry. And there was a small group of electricians that put in the temporary electric wiring for the booths and then remove it at the end of the show. And what happened was it had become very expensive to do trade shows in New York because of the Cosa Nostra influence, and they're putting people on the job who didn't necessarily need to be there. So you had to pay for people you didn't necessarily need. And the people who they were sending, the core of the people they had among the people who were actually skilled trade show workers were people who were just, wise guys who had, gone to jail for the family, and they had to get a job once they were on parole, so they just put them here regardless of their competence. And also, there was an enormous amount of theft that happened because some of these shows involved valuables, like the jewelry show. Obviously, lots of jewelry in the house. Some of the shows related to the fashion industry, you might have fur coats in there. The boat show, the car show, you often have very valuable items in these shows that get stolen. So to reach a point where a lot of companies, and also you'd have little things like, when people would be sent around to put up a booth, they would ask to get a tip. They would ask the person to pay them a tip on top of what they were paying for labor. We got to a point where a lot of trade associations would not have a show in New York because you had these people, criminals setting up your booth, or people, they perceived everyone that worked there as a criminal, even though only a few of them were. There's this perception, you're basically, you're paying, these very high prices, and you're getting very questionable service, and you're having to pay tips, and your stuff might get stolen. So basically, George Pataki raided the place, and what happened was they took it over, and instead of the contractors being able to use their own employees to work the trade shows, they used people. There was a pool of people registered with the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center Operating Authority who would work these shows, and you would work for the state but be assigned to a contractor to work for them. And also they created a list of like 200 people who were never allowed to work in the building again because they were people that were alleged to have ties to organized crime. So that's what that was about. And again, that was part of the process of cleaning out the rackets in the industry. And by and large, it succeeded. And today, the trade show services industry is a lot less of a racketeering presence than there was. I'm not going to say there's none, but it's not like it was. And it's that largely was a success rate. Now, of course, obviously, being this is America, once the Javits Center, the workforce had been cleaned out, suddenly the workforce becomes a lot more heavily Black and Hispanic because they're not hiring based on people picked out by wise guys. They're hiring based on the people that applied for the job. And you end up having a lawsuit about racial discrimination situation that I go into at some length, and the gender discrimination situation. And like all those lawsuits, what basically ends up happening is some of the people end up getting a payday. Are there still inequities in the hiring system at the Javits Center? I wouldn't know. I have not worked there in many years. You'd have to ask someone that works there now.
I've asked.
it wouldn't surprise me. But again, you have to ask someone who currently works there.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's not like it was back in the old days. It was not like, say, you have yachts being stolen from the boat show. It's not like you have, the people, the guy, the shop steward for the Carpenters Union being a professional handball player who was a longtime associate of organized crime as the shop steward, and an ex-taxi driver who also has a longtime association with organized crime as the assistant shop steward. It's not like that at all. And now, if you're someone like that, if you're someone who's about that life like that, you're not going to get hired at the Javits Center because it's a job of the state. The state troopers, after many years, were finally withdrawn from the Javits Center. There was no longer a need for them there. But for a long time, there was a large contingent of state troopers in the building.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let me ask you these two next questions. Two last ones. Now, I didn't know nothing about this. I don't know if this even exists. If this is still like I said, if this is even still in effect, and if this is just me, and you wrote this in your book. Again, just tell everybody, please, this is a must. You have to get this book. Many of our brothers and sisters are union workers. So this is the National Union Act, Labor's Union.
The Laborers International Union of North America.
Yeah. What can you explain that, please? Just again, it sounds self-explanatory, but is that a countrywide thing? Are we protected under that? I'm just asking those questions.
Basically, if I think I'm understanding your question correctly, local unions are generally affiliated to international unions, which are like umbrella bodies that represent the union across the country. Like the Teamsters local you're in is part of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. And this is true with most unions are affiliated to some broader parent organization. So, and the unions, or most unions, are affiliated to a body called the AFL-CIO, which is the Federation of Labor Unions. But for most workers, the main part of the union you deal with is your local union, which if you work for, a city government or for local contractors, probably the part of the union that deals with you most directly is your local union, but it's affiliated to a parent union, and those unions have certain set of rules that they have that all the local unions have to follow, and they have the unions pay a certain amount of your dues money goes to that parent union body. If you're a member of a Teamsters local, well, you pay dues to your local pays to a joint council, which is a parent body for all the Teamsters locals, in this case in the New York City, Westchester, Long Island area. And they also pay dues to the International Union, which represents all the Teamsters locals all over the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. Because, well, the Teamsters, like many unions, also has members in Canada and members in Puerto Rico. There are unions that only have members in the U.S., and that's how that works. Yeah. And basically a lot of what the national unions do is stuff like lobbying for pro-labor legislation. A lot of them also, if there's a problem in a local union, the international union will step in and reorganize things. If they catch somebody stealing from the union, they will remove the offices of the union. They'll put in a trustee and they'll reorganize the union until it can elect new leaders. And they'll monitor, make sure that the people who did the theft are, prosecuted and sued. So basically that's a lot of what international unions do. And pretty much every local union, the New York District Council of Carpenters is affiliated to the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners in America, which represents carpenter locals all across the United States and Canada. The Laborers Union is affiliated to the Laborers International Union in North America, which represents laborers locals all across the United States and Canada. And the international part is because most American unions also have members in Canada. Most local unions in Canada are affiliated to an international union based in the United States. But there are some unions in Canada that are affiliated to union bodies that only represent workers in Canada that represent locals all across Canada. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and just so I can say correctly, it's National Labor Relations Act. I didn't know nothing about it, so I was asking about that act.
You're talking about something different. National Labor Relations Act.
Yes, there you go. Thank you. National Labor Relations Act. That was my fault. I mispronounced it. I said talked about a union thing. It's the National Labor Relations Act. What is that?
All right. Well, let me explain. Well, basically, what happened was there was a time the first unions in America were formed. The first strikes in America were in the 1790s. The first unions started in the 1850s. And at that time, the legal doctrine on unions in the U.S. was basically the masters and servants doctrine of English common law, which says that servants, that is, say, workers, are not allowed to come together to use pressure to force their employers to raise their wages. That was a criminal conspiracy and restraint of trade. It was a criminal act to form a union or to go on strike. And this is the legal doctrine for many years. So the early unions that formed had to actually operate in a sort of, they were kind of illegal. One of the reasons they end up working with racketeers is because union activity in this country is illegal. The first changes in the laws are in 1790, in the 1890s when the Clayton Antitrust Act is passed, and the Clayton Antitrust Act legalizes unions. Doesn't give unions any sort of legal rights or power, but it makes the basic concept of a union legal, because at this point, there have been a lot of union activity. There had been a series of very big strikes in 1877. There was a very big nationwide strike in the railroad industry. It was another big strike in 1886 for the 8-hour day. That led to full-scale riots in Chicago. That led to the creation of May Day, International Workers' Day, as a holiday, commemorates that strike for the 8-hour day. So now unions existed and were using strikes to fight against the employers. So the government had to acknowledge unions existed. They weren't going anywhere, so they had to have some sort of legal status. But even then, most of what unions actually did was still illegal. You could have a union, but strikes, boycotts, picketing, all that other stuff is illegal. But union activity continues. Unions are starting to get stronger, especially in the railroad industry. In 1924, there was a series of very big national railroad strikes. So the federal government passes a law called the Railway Labor Act, which legalizes the unions in the construction industry, legalizes collective bargaining, requires that if you own a railroad, the majority of your workers in a given craft vote to have a union, they have a union, and you have to bargain with it. You can't get out of dealing with that union. Railroad Labor Act covers the railroads, the airlines, and oil pipelines, because those are interstate transportation. It's federally regulated, but that just applied to them. Now, there is a series of other laws that are passed reflecting other parts of the labor market, the private sector labor force. There's a law in 1931 passed called the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which says that federal judges can no longer issue court orders to order workers to stop being on strike. That is something that had been common up to that point. After 1931, that's illegal. Now, in the early 1930s, there's an enormous amount of union activity. There's an enormous amount of strikes, particularly a lot of the workers in heavy manufacturing, cars, steel, coal mining, the electrical products industry, oil refining. So in 1935, the Roosevelt administration passes a law called the National Labor Relations Act, which says that, well, now unions are legal if you're a private sector employee who works in interstate commerce. You work for a business that does business across state lines, which is most businesses. If you own a business that does more than like $50,000 worth of business, it's considered interstate commerce. There's a presumption that it's interstate commerce, and the National Labor Relations Act applies to you. And that is, it legalizes strikes. It creates a body called the National Labor Relations Board that unions can go to and employers can go to with complaints about unfair labor practices by the other party. And it creates a system where if you want to get a union in your workplace, you'll go to a body called the National Labor Relations Board, and they will hold an election. And if the majority of workers vote to have a union, they'll have a union. And then there's a process to which the employer can be compelled to recognize that union and compelled to bargain with that union. And that law governs all private sector employees, with some exception for all private sector employment in interstate commerce other than railroads, airlines, and oil pipelines. So if you work for a private sector company, odds are you're covered by the National Labor Relations Act. Public employees were not covered by it. Public employee collective bargaining at that point is still, it exists, but not really, doesn't really have a legal status. That doesn't happen until the 1860s. There's a wave of public sector organizing in the 1960s. And in states where there was a lot of public sector labor activity, like New York, like California, like Illinois, like Massachusetts, the state laws were passed legalizing collective bargaining, like New York State's Connon-Wadlin Act and the Taylor Law, which legalized collective bargaining for public employees in our state. But what the National Labor Relations Act is, it governs collective bargaining for private. If you work for General Motors, or you work for, Con Edison, or you work for Amazon or Citibank, that's kind of employer. Or even if you work for, like, say, a local construction contractor, but they do more than $50,000 worth of business in a year, they're governed by the National Labor Relations Act. There was a series of big strikes after World War II, and also there was a lot of the labor activists that had led these strikes were radical leftists, communists, socialists, anarchists. So because of that, in the 1940s, there was a series of amendments called the Taft-Hartley Act passed to the National Labor Relations Act. And basically, they put restrictions on unions. They created this thing called right to work, where a state can say that private sector unions in that state, you have to represent everyone in the unionized workplace, but they don't necessarily have to join the union or pay dues, which is designed to weaken unions financially. There's also restrictions that the Taft-Hartley Act put on workers going on strike, making it harder to go on strike, making it easier for employers to break strikes. And also, initially, when the Taft-Hartley Act was written, there was prohibitions against communists or any worker who was a political leftist being a leader in a union. That was later ruled to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court and was stripped from the law in the 1960s. But yeah, basically, the National Labor Relations Act is a law that governs labor relations. And also, it's a law that it restricts a lot of the stuff unions do, especially the Taft-Hartley amendments that were passed in 1947. Like, it's illegal for union members to refuse to handle, to do what's called a secondary boycott. That is, say there's a strike at a company and workers at other companies are back in the old days, they would refuse to handle merchandise from that company until the strike was settled. That's illegal now. You can't legally do that. And also, there's lots of restrictions on picketing. And a lot of the freedoms that Americans have to do protests are taken away from union workers by the Taft-Hartley, because there's a lot of rules about union picketing that basically are designed to make union picketing less effective. So it's easier for strike breakers to cross the picket line, and it's easier for a company to do business while its workers are on strike. So basically, that's the National Labor Relations Act, because it's a law that it was passed in response to workers' struggles, but it also it handicaps unions and workers in their struggles, and it's designed to weaken unions, and to a large degree it succeeded. Unions in America were much stronger in the 1940s than they are today. And the Taft-Hartley Act is a lot of the reason for that. Not the only reason. Racism and racketeering had a lot to do with it, but Taft-Hartley Act also. And racism and racketeering made it harder to fight Taft-Hartley. So unions were never able to effectively resist the Taft-Hartley Act. To this day, they're still not able to. So yeah, basically that is the short version of what the National Labor Relations Act is. But it's something that for public sector workers, National Labor Relations Act doesn't apply. If you're a public sector worker in New York State, you're governed by the Taylor Law. National Labor Relations Act, in theory, allows workers to go on strike, although it also allows employers to use lots of methods to fight them when they go on strike. But if you're a public sector worker in New York State, you absolutely cannot legally go on strike. Public sector unions cannot call a strike. So it actually, public employees in New York State have less rights than private sector workers governed under the National Labor Relations Act or the Railway Labor Act.
Okay. And I'm gonna ask one last question, sir. Sure. One last question.
Sure.
And this is a few, and I'm not gonna say their name because they told me to leave them nameless. And they are union members of CSEA. So they said I can say that. They said they gave me permission to say that. They said that they are employees in Westchester County in New York. So they said they gave me permission to say that.
Okay.
So, and I'm not a member of CSEA. I belong to a different union, but these are also my brothers that I know personally. And, when they have concerns, I asked them to ask me some questions, and, they all had different questions, but there was all one question that remained the same. So I said, I'll ask that one because that seems to be the one that stands out. So what they want to know is, what steps can a person take prior, knowing that the union is supposed to fight for you, but also they are looking out for the employer? So basically, how can I talk or talk about different issues or expose what's going on or how I'm being retaliated against or discriminated against or harassed, and my union is supposed to fight for me, paying union dues, but also I realize that my union is also in bed with their employer, so they're also helping them out to screw me more, for lack of a better term. What advice would you give to some of those CSEA workers that have this question?
Okay. Well, first, to clarify, the CSEA is the Civil Service Employees Association. It is an affiliate of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. It is a statewide organization that represents public employees for the state of New York, or some public employees for the state of New York, and employees in many local jurisdictions, including Westchester County, Nassau County, Suffolk County, etc. Basically, AFSCME members, state and local government, who are outside New York City. Well, as far as the substance of the question, if you feel that your union is not fighting for you and has a subordinate or a collaborative relationship with the employer, that they're willing to sacrifice your interest to preserve that, and if you have that perception, it's probably true. There probably is a situation going on. Your union probably is more interested in being cozy with the employer than they are with protecting you.
Correct.
A lot of you have that problem. You have to reach out to your fellow workers and organize to fight for political change in your union, to fight the leadership in your union, to fight to be the new leadership of the union, to fight to, when there's an election, run for office, be an activist in the union, challenge the union when they're not representing you. And when there's an election, to run for office, to change your union, to make it better. So basically, you have to organize with your coworkers to fight to make the union better and more effective, and to take over leadership of the union, to put a more struggle-oriented, worker-oriented leadership in charge of the union. So basically, you got to get together with your coworkers and organize to make things better. That's the short version. That's always what it boils down to. If there's a problem in your union, if you and your fellow workers aren't being represented, or if you don't have a union at your job and you want to have a union, it always comes down to you reaching out to your fellow workers, organizing together to make things better. That is the only power that workers have, is power of worker organization. But it always involves you reaching out to your fellow workers, seeing if they feel the same way as you do and they're willing to fight, and then uniting to struggle to make things better and to make the changes you need to make in your workplace and with your youth. Always comes down to that. That's always the answer to that question. No matter what union you're in, public sector, private sector, Taft-Hartley Act, Railway Labor Act, Taylor Law, no matter what labor law you might be covered under, no matter what, if you're a public employee down south where collective bargaining is illegal, same thing would apply there. Anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, anywhere where there's people that work for wages. You know, I give the same answer to a group of workers in Botswana or Newfoundland or, you know, or Luxembourg. I would give them the exact same answer. Come together with your coworkers and organize to fight to make things better at your job.
So to the CSEA workers, that is your answer. You know, so you gotta organize and come together, and somebody gotta run for that position to try to make things better or to make things better. You know, so on that note, Mr. Gregory A. Butler, definitely always a pleasure. Again, I must say again, everybody, please get this book. There's a lot of jewels in here, a lot of knowledge in here, a lot of facts in here. Disunited Brotherhoods, Race, Racketeering, in the Fall of the New York Construction Unions. This is a must. Like I said, there are so many brothers and sisters that are union workers that you need to know the history, the backstory, and, you know, so this is definitely important. Mr. Butler, thank you. It was always a pleasure. And, you know, I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, everybody, thank you for watching. It's Just Different with Ty. And make sure you like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Peace and love.
Peace.